Hi, Roger Linn here, and in this video I'm going to talk about and demonstrate expressive gestural control on LinnStrument, primarily with the goal of emulating fine acoustic instruments. So I will also talk at the end a little bit about how that would apply, those same gestural controls, or the same gestures would apply to electronic synthesis. And I have some thoughts about that. So what I'll do first of all is demonstrate a few different instruments and that you've seen in other videos I've done, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about the gestural control. So let's start with violin. In this case, I'm using Sample Modeling's violin, or rather their viola, which it has a little bit lower range. They have violin, viola, and cello. And nothing else comes close to sample modeling when it comes to bowed strings or orchestral winds. Samples, first of all, are just far too limited. They're not malleable. They're great when you're playing with an on-off switch keyboard, but when you want to change their loudness continuously and their pitch continuously and the timbre continuously, it just doesn't work. You really can't crossfade between samples realistically enough, whereas every single one of Sample Modeling's instruments perfectly emulates under expressive control the specific instrument that is that product. So I'll start with the viola here, and I'll play a Stefan Grappelli line. A little flub there, but you get the idea. So what I will say about violin is that generally you have to have a fairly wide vibrato. That's just the way that violinists tend to play. That sounds more realistic than something like that. And that's because it's emotion and it's power. And the other thing I would say is that you want to be able to use that pressure as you're playing, and it's kind of, rubbing your tummy and patting your head, but you want to do a few things at once. You want to practice using that pressure to add expression as you add vibrato strength or width. So, for example, so another instrument I'll talk about is sax. Now, for saxophone, in comparison to a violin, you want to have a much narrower vibrato. In fact, your modulation wants to be just a little bit of pitch change in terms of vibrato, but actually even more of perhaps a tremolo, pulsing of the volume. So all that time I was playing with far less vibrato width than with the violin, and then I was using also the pressure to try and emulate the sensitive wind control that a horn player would have, or a reed player. So you want to use that pressure subtly. Something like that. So that gives you a little bit on sax. Now I'm going to move on to guitars. And first would be the pedal steel. So I'm going to put LinnStrument into MPE mode because these are polyphonic instruments. And pedal steel guitar is a wonderful instrument. I have played it a little bit. I'm not any great shakes at it. But it has a few characteristic gestures when you're playing country music. It's usually in a major key, and it's usually in 3/4 time if you're doing traditional suite steel. But there are a couple of characteristic gestures. Number one, you would play an octave and then bend the fifth underneath it to up to the sixth, like this. And you do them at the same time. Or you can bend the fifth, or hold the fifth while bending the second below it to a third. Or the third case would be taking the octave and below it bending the second to the third. So, and you can slide up harmonies. But if you put a lot of those, or a lot of those gestures in that I described, you'll sound a lot like the traditional pedal steel. And then you have a nice vibrato on things, because you always have that bar shimmy, whatever they call it, to get the vibrato with the bar. Now the next one is slide guitar distortion. And I'm a guitar player, and so this one's near and dear to my heart. And I always loved the sound that guys like Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix got with distortion. So this is a blues slide guitar sound, and lends itself very well to the sliding pitch of LinnStrument. And so since it's in blues, you want to use the blues scale, of course, and that is best done if you want to play the lights on LinnStrument by playing in the key of D or A. So if I'm playing in A, I'm getting a minor scale. But you want to play it by a lot of slides. And blues is characterized by that ambiguous third that's between the major and minor third, and then sliding around between the fourth and the fifth as well. So for example, so I'm starting with that minor third. I'll play it up an octave. Minor to major. And you can play them together, and those tones in between lend to that bluesiness. And then always sliding down at the end of the note helps. Another thing, a characteristic gesture of blues guitar players or rock guitar players, is sliding one note into the other of the same pitch. So if you hold two notes that are a whole tone apart and you slide the lower one up to the pitch of the other one, that's a characteristic gesture. So if I take this D on top and the C below it and slide the C into the D, you can do it on one row too, but it's just easier because you get to wiggle both notes at the same time if you do it on different rows. And all those wonderful combinations of holding one note while sliding another are very much part of that blues sound. Now this is the same thing as, the same thing is done in blues harmonica, but this has the added expressive control of pressure. So in this case, there are a few gestures. Number one, let's say we're in the key of A minor, blues. Well, I'm going to play with those gestures quite a bit. So first of all, I'm going to play the A and the E below it with one finger. In fact, I'm going to go up an octave. Now you want to use that ambiguous minor major third. And if you're playing at the same time, you get that intermodulation distortion of the amplifier. Now you notice when I slid from the fourth to the fifth, I actually slid from the augmented fourth to the fifth, which is another characteristic blues gesture on harmonica especially. Just play around, practice that ambiguous blues third, that major minor third. The other thing is a great characteristic lick on harmonica is toggling between the fifth and the dominant seventh. And then there was another lick that I think Norton Buffalo did once, and it was like this. So that'll give you some stuff to play around with on the blues harmonica. Now the next question that comes to mind is, though this is very, very good for traditional instruments, excuse me, though it's very good for traditional acoustic instruments, how does this apply to synthesis? And I think ultimately nobody knows. But it will probably encompass a lot of the same gestures that have been used in older music styles, and will also emulate the human voice. Now what's interesting is that in popular music right now, there is no instrumental solo. That is to say, in electronically generated pop songs, it's just disappeared. You won't hear it in techno pop of any sort. You won't hear it in hip hop of any sort. And I want that to come back. And I think that's what LinnStrument is all about. The reason perhaps that we've all collectively voted that that instrumental solos are not quite important enough for prime time is that they've all been played with MIDI keyboards, which are largely on-off switches. And so that sort of expression that comes from the human voice or from acoustic instruments of the past doesn't exist. Well, now it does. And so I think that what will happen is we'll start to see a new generation of synthesis heroes, instrumental stars, in the same way that when I was a young man, I was very enthralled with the guitar playing of Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix or Jeff Beck or others, or some of the other instrumentalists on other instruments. And there really are none of those right now. There are DJs, but there are not expressive solo performers, people that are really largely considered by the public to be artists. And I think that is something that is coming, and that we'll start to see more instrumental solos in popular recordings and other recordings. And it's just a question of what the sounds will be and how some of those expressive gestures, either from copied from the human voice in popular records today or from past instrumental heroes, will be applied to the new sound. And I can't wait to see. But I have an example here. Here's a sound that I created in Logic's Sculpture. Oh, and by the way, all the sounds you heard, except for the first, the violin and the sax, are part of my free downloadable sounds file, project file, for either Logic or MainStage on the Apple platform. So here's a sound I created in Sculpture, which is their physical modeling synthesizer. And it's just a wonderful instrument, very malleable. The nature of physical modeling is it lends itself very, very well to expressive control. And so here's a sound I created that contains elements of bowing, like in a cello, elements of hammering, like a hammer dulcimer, elements of feedback, like a guitar with feedback from an amplifier, and even elements of a very dissonant sound. So I can use pressure to control the volume of the note and the harmonic content. Notice that little hammering in the background. But when I tilt forward, I love that sound. I don't know, something like that may find itself into a recording, because I find it wonderfully expressive, but it's a new sound. Yet it has clues that remind us of traditional sounds. So at any rate, I invite you to try and learn some of these gestures. And if you're an instrument owner right now, if you could make some videos that would be examples of what virtuosic solo performance in the modern era would be on synthesis, I would certainly appreciate it, and I'd like to post it on the site. Thank you very much.